Canada just made one of the most sensitive moves it could make in this geopolitical moment, and Washington is not treating it like some boring trade memo. This is Canada reopening major economic channels with China at the exact moment the United States is already using tariffs, national security language, and political pressure against both Canada and China. So when you see a title suggesting that the US sounds the alarm, that is not coming out of nowhere. And if Ottawa thought it could quietly deepen ties with Beijing without triggering a response south of the border, that theory is being stress-tested in real time. Prime Minister Mark Carney went to Beijing and announced what he called a new strategic partnership with China, and the moment he did that, this stopped being a normal bilateral story and became a North American power story. Now, from Ottawa's point of view, the pitch is pretty straightforward. The government says the world order is changing, the trading system is being reshaped, and Canada cannot afford to remain overly dependent on one market forever, and on paper, that argument has real logic behind it. Every middle power wants more room to maneuver. Every export economy wants more than one lifeline. But here is the problem. Diversification is not just a word. Diversification depends on who the new partner is, what kind of relationship is being built, and how your largest ally interprets that shift. If Canada were talking about a routine expansion with a low-risk partner, this would land very differently. But Canada is not talking about a low-risk partner. It is talking about China, and the United States does not view China as just another market. That is why the details matter so much. Canada's own finance department said Minister François-Philippe Champagne went to China to advance trade and financial services partnerships. Financial services partnerships, that is not some minor throwaway line. That is one of the most sensitive phrases in the entire story, the official release. Also said both sides saw value in improving two-way trade and investment, including in financial services, and it announced the launch of a Canada-China Financial Working Group. That means this is not just about selling more goods. This is about building structure. It is about building channels. It is about creating formal mechanisms for deeper engagement in finance, and when a country as economically fused to the United States as Canada starts building new financial rails with China, Washington does not see that as a harmless experiment. It sees a strategic signal, whether Ottawa likes that or not. Carney reinforced that signal himself. In Beijing, he said Canada and China were forging a new strategic partnership. In separate remarks, he talked about a broader plan to diversify trade, deepen partnerships abroad, and build new connections with China that could create opportunities for Canadian workers. He also framed the China relationship as part of a wider effort to reduce overdependence on Canada's largest trading partner. But from an American perspective, especially under Trump, that sounds like a close ally trying to build more strategic space with Washington's biggest long-term rival, and that is where the gap opens up between the way Ottawa is selling the move and the way Washington is reading it. Ottawa says pragmatism, diversification, and new opportunities. Washington hears drift, exposure, and a crack in the perimeter. And once you understand that gap, the tone of the U.S. reaction makes much more sense. This is not really about whether Canada has the formal right to talk to China. Of course it does. The real issue is whether the United States is willing to tolerate a deeper Canada-China reset at a time when U.S. policy treats tariffs, trade pressure, and economic leverage as tools of strategic control. Reuters reported that Carney's moves diverged from U.S. policy, particularly on Chinese electric vehicles, and that members of Trump's cabinet criticized the direction. Because once senior figures in Washington start treating a Canadian policy move as a meaningful divergence on China, the story is no longer just about trade. It becomes a test of alignment, and for a country like Canada, alignment is never abstract. It has costs and consequences. And under Trump, those consequences can arrive very quickly. Now add the security dimension, because this is where the story gets even more combustible. During Carney's Beijing press conference, reporters directly asked him about earlier statements describing China as a major security threat to Canada. They also asked about foreign interference, election concerns, and whether more Chinese investment and more Chinese EV access created new risks. Carney did not brush those questions off as nonsense. He said the threat environment had increased, the risks had multiplied, and that Canada was trying to manage those risks through resilience, alliances, and engagement. That is a crucial point. Ottawa is not saying the danger vanished. It is saying the danger is real but manageable. But it also changes the entire political meaning of the reset. Because once you admit the risks are real, you are no longer debating a harmless trade expansion. You are debating whether the upside is worth the exposure, and whether the guardrails are strong enough to hold one's money. Infrastructure and leverage start moving through the system. Carney tried to reassure people on that front by talking about red lines, law enforcement cooperation, and a more structured relationship with China that could be predictable rather than chaotic. But predictable does not mean safe. Predictable does not mean cost-free, and predictable definitely does not mean Washington will accept. In fact, that word may have made the politics even worse, because when a Canadian Prime Minister says recent progress with China has made the relationship more predictable, the obvious comparison comes into view immediately: predictable compared with whom? Predictable compared with what? If people inside the United States hear that as a quiet contrast with the White House, the symbolism gets much sharper. This stops sounding like Canada just opening new trade lines and starts sounding like Canada deciding that, in some areas, Beijing may now look easier to deal with than Washington, even if Ottawa does not intend that message. It is easy to see how it could be received that way. And that brings us to the line that turned a tense situation into an openly confrontational one. Reuters reported Trump saying that if Canada did a deal with China, the United States would do something very substantial. Then he went even further, saying, "We don't want China to take over Canada," and warning that if Canada made the deal Carney was pursuing, China will take over Canada. That is not standard diplomatic friction. That is Trump taking Canada's China opening and recasting it as a sovereignty threat that requires an American response. What exactly is very substantial? More tariffs? Sector-specific retaliation? A harder line in future trade talks? Auto pressure? Financial pressure? Supply chain pressure? Once that threat is on the table, uncertainty itself becomes part of the punishment. This also was not the first warning shot. Reuters separately reported that Trump had threatened 100% tariffs on Canada if it finalized the China deal, while China responded by insisting that its arrangements with Canada were not aimed at any third party. That gives you the triangle in full. Ottawa says diversification. Beijing says cooperation. Washington says move further in that direction and we will hit back. And because this White House had already framed tariffs on Canada and China as part of a national security and emergency posture, the threat carries more credibility than it would in a normal administration. Trump is not improvising in a vacuum. Here, he is operating inside a broader political doctrine that treats market access as leverage and leverage as power. That is why this story cannot be dismissed as campaign rhetoric or cable news drama. The underlying toolkit already exists, the precedent already exists, the willingness to use economic pressure as a geopolitical weapon already exists. Then there is the domestic Canadian split, and that matters because it shows this is not simply America versus Canada. It is also Canada versus itself. Ontario Premier Doug Ford criticized the EV side of the China deal and warned that Ottawa was inviting a flood of cheap Chinese-made vehicles without matching guarantees for Canada's auto sector, economy, or supply chain. That is not a fringe reaction. That is the Premier of Canada's manufacturing heartland signaling that the federal government may be taking on too much risk too quickly, and it is not hard to see why the backlash landed. Carney's arrangement would allow up to 49,000 Chinese EVs into the Canadian market at a 6.1% tariff rate. Supporters say lower prices, more access, and future investment could help Canada's transition and improve affordability. Critics say Canada is exposing a strategically sensitive sector to a state-backed rival precisely when North American industrial alignment matters most. Both arguments have force, and that is what makes the politics so unstable. The deeper problem is that this is not one policy choice. It is a stack of choices. There is the EV opening, there is the canola relief and broader agricultural access, there is the push for more Chinese investment in clean energy and other sectors, there is the financial services relationship and the working group, there is the broader trade roadmap, there is the rhetorical shift toward calling the relationship strategic, durable, and expansive. Any one of those moves can be defended on its own. Put them all together and the picture changes. Then it starts to look less like tactical diversification and more like a serious effort to thicken the relationship across multiple systems at once. That is exactly the kind of cumulative shift the United States tends to watch most closely. Washington does not separate these files the way Ottawa would prefer. It looks at the sum, it looks at precedent, it looks at whether a core ally is normalizing deeper economic integration with China inside the North American sphere. Timing makes all of this even riskier. If Canada had attempted the same reset under a calmer American administration or during a less confrontational phase in US-China competition, maybe it could have moved more gradually and with less noise. But this is not a calm phase. This is a period when tariffs are central, alignment is under stress, and Trump is perfectly willing to personalize geopolitical disputes. So Canada is not repositioning in a neutral environment. It is repositioning in the middle of a live pressure campaign. That means even moves Ottawa considers measured can look provocative from Washington. It means even partial openings can trigger maximum rhetoric, and it means Canadian officials are not just managing trade policy, they are managing ego, perception, and the risk that the White House decides to make an example out of them. That is why the story feels so volatile. It is not just about economics, it is about how economics, symbolism, and power all collide at once. From here, Canada basically has two paths, and neither one is painless. Path 1 is Ottawa keeps pushing. It sticks with the Carney line: diversification, pragmatism, more China access, more market openings, more structured cooperation. If that is the path, Canada is effectively betting that the long-term gains from broader optionality outweigh the near-term costs of American retaliation. That is a serious gamble, because the United States has far more ways to punish Canada than Canada has ways to offset the punishment. Path 2 is Ottawa slows down. It keeps the rhetoric but softens the implementation. It tries to preserve some agricultural gains, some diplomatic thaw, and some business confidence without looking like it is building a full-spectrum strategic partnership with Beijing that may be politically safer, but it also carries a price. Once you have publicly sold a new era, a roadmap, and a strategic partnership, backing away can look like weakness. So either way, Canada pays something. Either in economic friction with the United States or in political credibility at home and abroad. And that is the trap at the center of the whole story. Canada wants autonomy, but autonomy has costs. Canada wants diversification, but diversification can trigger retaliation if it crosses the wrong line. Canada wants Chinese demand, Chinese investment, and broader export opportunity, but it also wants privileged access to the American market, continental supply chain integration, and strategic trust inside North America. At some point, those priorities stop expanding together. At some point, a government has to rank them. And once that moment arrives, the language of win-win gets a lot harder to sustain. This is why the verified version of the story is actually stronger than the exaggerated version. You do not need conspiracy theories or wild detours to make this compelling. The real pressure point is already there. Canada is moving toward deeper China engagement, the United States is responding with open hostility and credible leverage, and Ottawa may soon have to decide whether the upside of diversification is worth the cost of provoking its most powerful neighbor. So let's land this clearly. Did the United States sound alarm bells? Yes, publicly. Did Canada make a real move toward China? Yes, publicly. Did Trump go hostile? Based on the public record, absolutely, threatening a very substantial response and framing a Canada-China deal as China taking over Canada is openly hostile language, especially coming from the president of the country that dominates Canada's trade environment, and that is why this story matters. Canada is not drifting into some cartoon collapse scenario tomorrow morning, but it is stepping into a high-risk zone where trade policy, sovereignty optics, industrial strategy, and American pressure all collide. And if Ottawa keeps moving in this direction, the next phase will not just be speeches. It will be retaliation, bargaining, pressure campaigns, and real consequences for sectors that live or die by cross-border access. So now I want your take. Is Carney making a smart diversification play Canada needed anyway, or is Ottawa underestimating just how hard Trump will hit if he decides Canada is getting too comfortable with Beijing?